So Rudy Gobert got paid and then some. And as the title suggests, I think this is an overpay. I don't think this is a crazy opinion to have about this one. I think this makes Gobert the third highest paid player ever, the most expensive center ever, which is mainly just due to the cap keeps going up and that's the way money works. But, oh boy, I mean, the Jazz have now locked themselves into their team, a team that is good and could be a conference finals team if things bounce their way or whatever. But when we think about Gobert, the player, he's pretty much a guarantee to have the Jazz be a playoff team. I think they have one of the higher floors of any team in the Western Conference. But at the same time, I don't think they have one of the highest ceilings. And part of that is because Gobert has to be in the game. And offensively, he is limited. Sure, he sets screens, he grabs offensive rebounds, but he can't attack switches. He's not a playmaker. He doesn't space the floor out at all. And sometimes his free throw shooting can get a little too bad. When you combine that with the fact that defensively, Gobert's value drops off a bit in the playoffs, he suddenly becomes a guy who's just not as valuable. We saw in the Denver series that when he was matched up one-on-one on Jokic, it didn't make too much of a difference. And that's not to say that anyone can handle that. It's just when Anthony Davis gets beat by Jokic a few times, he can also still drop 30 on the other end. And we saw what happened with the Rockets 2 years in a row. The money that they're giving Gobert to be this defensive player, can he switch? I don't think he does it as well as Bam does, or as well as AD does. And by the way, both of those guys are currently being paid less than Gobert. But again, this pretty much guarantees that the Jazz are going to be a playoff team for the entirety of his contract. Because if Gobert is your starting center, you're going to be, at worst, I don't know, the fourth best defensive team in the regular season. And I know we take things for granted as NBA fans. Like, we don't appreciate the fact that the Jazz are in the playoffs every year. I mean, if we're constantly going to point out teams that don't make the postseason for however long stretches, then we also need to acknowledge teams that get there every season and give the fans a respectable product. And to go off of that, what else were the Jazz really going to do here? I mean, I know I've already seen it. They should have traded him as opposed to giving him this contract. And it's like, okay, what could they have gotten for him? I think the first team that I would notice as I survey the league and think, well, who could have made a move for Gobert? The first one is Brooklyn, but they're all in on Harden at the moment, so that probably wouldn't have happened. And even if it did happen, you're getting a fraction of the Harden offer. I could have pictured the Hornets being interested in that sort of thing. The starting point of that sort of thing probably would have been Terry Rozier and Cody Zeller. Maybe Miles Bridges would have been the bargaining chip or whatever. Apparently Dallas was rumored for Gobert. I don't believe that, given that Dallas has made it pretty obvious how they value big guys with these $10 million contracts to Kleba and Dwight Powell. But if that would have been a move, then the starting point would have been Tim Hardaway Jr. Does that sound like the beginning of a great return for the Jazz, giving up on the guy who guarantees them a playoff appearance every season? And then I think you're just looking at teams that aren't that good right now, like the Spurs. Maybe the Spurs would have given you something, but you probably wouldn't have gotten Derek White or DeJounte. And another thing about all this, too, is the Jazz draft pick situation. Because let's say you think they should have gotten off of Gobert, and maybe you're not a playoff team, but you can be better for it later on, right? Well, their draft pick situation doesn't really lead to them doing that sort of thing. Now, maybe you would have gotten some picks for the guy. I acknowledge that. But when we're talking about lottery picks specifically, if the Jazz draft pick this upcoming season, if they finish between number 8 and number 14, it goes to the Grizzlies because of the Mike Conley deal, which means their pick would have to end up in the top 7 for them to actually get it after making themselves a lottery team by getting off of Gobert. Unless you think that they could have gotten back into the postseason with a Gobert trade. But there is a scenario in which they get off of Gobert, they end up number 9 in the lottery, don't get their pick. And then you think about that scenario. Think about that from Donovan Mitchell's perspective. And you can say the Mitchell-Gobert relationship, okay, that's fair. But think about it from Mitchell's perspective. playoffs 3 straight years. Suddenly they're bad. They didn't get their draft pick, and we know how it goes when star players are not on good teams in the NBA nowadays. And you could say, well, Mitchell would be all fine. You don't know that. But what we do know is that with Gobert, they're making the playoffs. Unless, again, you think that they could have gotten an awesome return for Gobert. I mean, they signed Derek Favors. Do we think Favors can have them being, I don't know, let's say the 9th best defense in the league if Gobert has been traded for some perimeter talent, shooting, or whatever? I don't know. I'm sure there's a move out there. I can't really find it off the top of my head. I know that there was a bit of like Celtics Hayward for Gobert back before Hayward went to Charlotte. But if that was going to happen, it would have had to have been a sign and trade, which means Hayward would have had to have agreed to go back to Utah. And 2, I don't really know if the Celtics would have wanted Gobert. And a lot of that's because of the money that they, to me, would not have been willing to give Gobert, whereas Utah is okay with it. And also, again, then the Jazz would have had to figure out everything on defense. The way that I look at it is, if the ultimate goal is to win a championship, the Jazz had 2 paths. They could either have what they have right now, guarantee themselves success every season, and try to build on that, or they could go into the unknown, which is whatever the hell would have happened if they looked to move Gobert. Now, is it possible that they could have been better on the other side of that? Yeah. I mean, you never know with this stuff. We said that the Pacers lost the Paul George trade. They got 2 All-Stars out of it. So yeah, for whatever all that means. So now if we can think about the Jazz and their place in the West and ways that they can improve the roster and all that, I mean, like I said in the beginning of the video, they're pretty much locked into what they are for a few years. Even if Conley is gone after this season, which they would hope he's not because they gave up some stuff for him. But, you know, he didn't have the best regular season last year. We'll see how he looks this year. They would still be over the cap considerably because of, you know, Gobert and Donovan Mitchell, and they gave Jordan Clarkson an extension. Boyan's money's still there. They're very much locked into what this team is right now. If there's a tradable contract, it might be Joe Ingles. I mean, he's very solid, but he's also starting to decline, which, you know, he came into the league at like 29 years old. That's what's going to happen. The Favors signing was one that should help them when Gobert is not in the game, and for all the talk about how the Gobert Favors frontcourt didn't work, I mean, the numbers were always pretty alright. So they could be a very solid team. They could win the math every single game in the regular season and get to a mid to higher seed in the West. Granted, positive tests are going to be the real determining factor in which teams are good this year. But, yeah, now once again, I think playoff-wise, when you start going into specific matchups, it gets a little dicey. I mean, I got a Blazers video that's coming out maybe today. If Harden gets traded later, that'll probably get pushed to a later day. And in that video, I say if the Blazers and the Jazz meet up in the postseason, I'm trusting the Blazers because I don't trust Gobert to defend Damian Lillard like that. So I get it. It's an overpay for the guy, but, you know, the first 6 minutes of the video. Now, of course, Donovan Mitchell just becoming one of the whatever best players in the league could counter a lot of this stuff, and the guy was amazing in the bubble, 50-point games and all that good stuff. We'll have to see. He averaged 36 points on 53% shooting in the bubble. He was basically the greatest player of all time for a 7-game stretch. Although the Game 7 wasn't as awesome, but to be nice, not many guys have good Game 7s. It's the way it is. So, you know, maybe Mitchell will just end up being the, 12th best player in the league this season and hitting a whole lot of pull-up threes, and his mid-range really took a step up last year. I mean, he was already good to very good, but he became elite last year for mid-range, in my opinion. I mean, wasn't too far away from Chris Paul percentages from 15 feet or so. I think the thing that can really take his efficiency to another level, though, is more free throw attempts. And for that, maybe he'll have to stop taking a few of those mid-rangers. You could argue he's maybe a little too quick to attempt them sometimes. But of course, they go in so much, it's not as bad as other guys. So we'll see. But maybe Mitchell could get to 7 free throw attempts a game or so. I don't think it's crazy. I mean, he's improved as a ball handler. He's gotten better at reading defenses. His playmaking is probably still not where it needs to be, given how often he has the ball, but he's improving at other things. So there's that. The Conley stuff, I don't know. I'm a little skeptical on Conley. I know he was better in the bubble, but I usually choose to be more cautious when a player or a team doesn't look too good for a long stretch and then they look good for a shorter stretch. And I'm just going to choose to do that here. I mean, Conley's going to be a few months older compared to the bubble. His fit with Gobert, a little awkward. Gobert doesn't space the floor out as much as Gasol does. And Conley missed a bunch of his floaters, which that could just be a bad luck sort of thing, and he'll be back to normal this year. Or maybe he just simply doesn't have the burst that he once did, on top of there's a guy rolling to the rim all the time instead of popping and that sort of thing. Then you got Clarkson and Boyan and Royce O'Neal, and I mentioned the Derek Favors thing again. It's a pretty solid roster. It's just not a great one. And I just think about how can the Jazz really become title contending with this team, and it's like, well, Mitchell can grow into being one of the 5 best players in the league or so. Actually, he has to do that, because that's how you actually win a title in the NBA, is you have one of the elite among elite players. So it's either that, or they trade for that sort of dude. The problem with that is, number one, just look at the roster. These players are not getting you a top whatever guy, unless you're putting Mitchell in the move, which they're not going to do. Or, number two, is they would just offload a whole bunch of picks, which that's not going to work because they've got picks locked up from the Conley trade. And so the only way for the Jazz to really win a title, to me, is they need to be like the Spurs from earlier this decade, where they're just so good at everything that it puts them over the top, even if they don't have a top 5 player or something. And just so we remember, Kawhi averaged 18 points a game in that finals. He did not average 30 or something. So that's the model for the Jazz. Again, feel free to disagree with me on the Gobert thing. I just don't know what the other option would have been. I mean, could you go the route of just getting a couple of cheap centers? Sure, but it's not a guarantee you're good on defense that way, which is more exciting if it's paired up with being an elite offense, but it's tough to get. So, the Jazz went this route. I don't fault them for it. I also acknowledge it is an overpay, and I am still skeptical of Gobert in specific playoff matchups, as in all of them. But, again, I just don't know if there was any option besides this that was really that good.